and welcome to the 7th Annual Bay Area Book Festival. I am Sherilyn Parsons, the founder and director of the festival, and I am delighted to introduce our event tonight. So tonight's program is the book launch, yay, for the new anthology, There's a Revolution Outside, My Love. We are thrilled to have with us the book's co-editor, Tracy K. Smith, along with contributors Reginald Dwayne Betts and Camille T. Dungy, with the conversation moderated by Ismail Muhammad. So because there are 4 people to introduce, I'll try to make these brief, or at least to talk really fast. Tracy K. Smith has authored 4 acclaimed poetry collections: The Body's Question, Duende, the Pulitzer Prize winning the Pulitzer Prize winning poetry collection, Life on Mars, and Wade in the Water, plus the memoir, Ordinary Light. In 2017, she was named U.S. Poet Laureate. She teaches at Princeton and hosts American Public Media's daily radio program and podcast, The Slowdown. Reginald Dwayne Betts is the founder and director of the Million Book Project, which, according to its mission, just beautifully stated, harnesses the power of literature to counter what prison does to the spirit. Definitely check out the amazing website, millionbookproject.org. Dwayne is the author of Felon Poems, 2 additional volumes of poetry, and a memoir. He's also a graduate of Yale Law School. Camille T. Dungy has authored 4 acclaimed collections of poetry, most recently Trophic Cascade, and the essay collection Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History. She's edited 3 anthologies, including Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, and she's been awarded several fellowships, including the Guggenheim, and she teaches at Colorado State University. So last off, Ismail Muhammad, our moderator, is a story editor at the New York Times Magazine and a distinguished visiting writer in creative nonfiction at St. Mary's College of California MFA program for the 2021 spring semester. He has a PhD in English from UC Berkeley, and his work, which focuses on literature, art, identity, and Black popular and visual culture, has appeared in many publications such as the Paris Review, the Atlantic, and the Nation, where he's a contributing writer. He's also the criticism editor for The Believer and Ziziva, and there's more. But you can already see that he's a busy guy, so we're grateful that he's with us tonight and all of our speakers. So please take it away, Ishmael.
Thank you, Sherilyn, for that lovely introduction. Just want to start off by saying it's so good to be here with Tracy and Camille and Dwayne. I've been reading you all for a long time. I feel like I've learned so much from you by reading your work. So it means a lot to be in conversation with you this evening. So thank you for being here. I just want to start off before we get into the book with a kind of broad question that I think is important to think about, that the title prompts me to think about. I want to know what you all think of as the relationship, or I guess maybe relationships, between protest, mourning, and healing. Because it feels like, to me, at least it felt to me last year, that healing and protest, or mourning and protest, didn't always go together. They didn't always converge. So I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Tracy, and kind of putting this book together with John. What were you thinking of as the relationships between those 3 nodes?
I love that question. It makes me think about the way that I always had imagined those things were like separate stages of a process. Maybe I feel that's a little bit naive, because what I've imagined has been happening within and around me is that we're moving back and forth between these different acts, mindsets, positions, and they feed and minister to and activate one another. Maybe now, like, this feels like one of the most emphatic moments in my adult life, where a sense of urgency and and also a sense of possibility, feel like they're very close to one another. I think that the healing is happening in different depths for me. You know, there's the private sense of betrayal as an individual that is awake and alive in me, alongside the feeling of betrayal as a citizen in a nation, that I don't always feel as intensely. And then there's this sense of, okay, I'm one of the people who's going to contribute to what might feel like healing. I want to be called to be one of those people. And so what does that lead me to do? I feel like in some ways the book is people using their voices to decide where in that process they are and what those first steps might need to look or feel like.
I really love and felt very deeply last year and this year that sense of like oscillation between those three modes. And it makes you think of the poem that you contributed to the anthology, Camille. This Will Hurt Me More, just because I want to talk more about that poem later. But there was a sense of like oscillation between like.
Hold on, wait! You got the anthology?
Yo, I think it was moderator's privilege, maybe.
Sorry, I was just excited. I don't have the anthology.
Oh,
it's very good. I can tell you that.
Maybe it's on your doorstep right now.
But yeah, Camille, I feel like your poem has a sense of like oscillation between various times, ages, like perspectives, like geographical locations. And so I'm wondering what you make of Tracy's response.
One thing Tracy said was this idea that these things operated in some kind of order or continuum. But people talk about the stages of grief, the 5 stages of grief, as if it's you have one and then the next day you have the next and the next day, but that's not how grief works. They happen in waves and rolls, and you regress, and that's also how learning works, and that's how healing works. That it's not a linear kind of progression from wounding to healing, and it can never be a progression of that without the attention and the kind of diagnosis, essentially, that writing can offer, where we can sort of look at the wound and really see the wound and the cause of the wound, to hope for some kind of healing. And yet, how many of our, if I'm going to say with that idea of a wound and how the body heals, how many of our therapies actually cause rewounding or cause other kinds of damage or trauma, to cut out that which is diseased or problematic. And so I think it just makes sense to think about this process of healing ourselves and moving forward as a nation, and healing the generative wounds of this nation. It can't happen in a summer. It can't happen immediately. And it's not like we're just going to wake up one day and be like, done, we're all healed, right? Like, because every time like that, we address one issue, we're going to turn around and be like, oh, wow, that gives me time to look and see this, this other thing over here now. And so I think that it's a long process, and it can, bend towards justice, as that frequently requoted Martin Luther King Jr. quote is, but it's long. It's a long arc to get there. And I don't know that it's a straight one.
Yeah. And I've come to you lastly, Dwayne, because I think your essay, which I think first appeared in the Times Magazine, I think deals with a similar kind of like ambiguity of the kind that Camille was just describing, the notion that, one can heal simply or easily in the manner of a process from either being incarcerated or from violence being done to one's family. So I wonder what you think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I find myself in good company with the piece, um, and with this, with this anthology. Um, but it's not necessarily predictable company, which is to say that even as poets are the ones most likely to buck the trend of the expected, and poets do it in really profound and interesting ways. Some of the ways in which we aren't noticed is what allows us to do this. And I wrote that piece for the New York Times Magazine, and it's interesting because the truth is, one of the things that didn't disturb me but surprised me was how many of my righteous friends, legal scholars, mostly advocates, people who were sort of doing the work around mass incarceration, didn't really talk publicly or think publicly about the piece. Didn't retweet it, didn't share it. When I talked about going to prison and then getting a law degree, it was all cool, you know. But when I talked about trying to grapple with the ways in which my hands and the hands of others have caused people in my community violence, and how the narrative that the police are the only enemies that we can name is not one that I could handle easily. He was like, I ain't trying to talk about that shit. Can you talk about you being a lawyer again? I mean, what's that bootstrap shit you was on before? Can you bring that back? And so I'm glad to be in this anthology, because I think it's one of those moves where, thinkers and writers are saying, hey, but we got to make this complicated. And for me, what's interesting about the whole thing is that we talk about healing and recognition, and it's like the recognition of what? And I think the piece was trying to be me admitting that part of the recognition was that this is just not ever an easy conversation.
Mhm.
I mean, it's interesting. I said something one time. I said, every time somebody gets wrongfully convicted, it's somebody that did that shit, right? Like literally, right? Like it's somebody that did that shit, and we could have this conversation about the wrongfully convicted and forget to figure out how do we talk about the person that did it. And part of the failure to catch the person that did it is because we have no adequate way to discuss what to do with that person, and really how to address harm and prevent harm coming in the future. So I don't know. I mean, I was happy to write it and happy to be in the anthology, but maybe the latter, I was more happier to be in the anthology because it means that it's a possibility to instigate some different conversations that I felt like that piece hasn't been a part of in a way that I would have liked.
Mhm. I love the way that you remind us or assert that one of the problems is that we're trying to solve something with our faults. I love the way that you phrase it, our sense of what is the answer to these questions, and our sense of what the problem is coming out of our flaws, our imaginative flaws. And one of the things that the voices in this anthology say or offer for me is a new way of thinking about what our collective imagination looks like, or what it could look like. And to me, that seems like a really necessary thing to start trying to rebuild,
I mean, speaking of imagination, I think both of your responses just make me think, during your talking about, friends who are activists or legal advocates, or, who work in politics, responding mutedly to that piece. It makes me think that, I mean, that essay is a work of literature, right? It's not doing the same thing that, say, a nonfiction, critique of the criminal justice system is meant to do, right? And I wonder if some people just got it and didn't know what to do with the questions you're working through there. And I guess my question is, I assume that this book's existence assumes that literature plays a particular role in this healing, or in this conversation about how to make our nation more humane and just. But maybe it's not the same role that like activism or politics, plays in that conversation. And so I wonder, I'll throw this to you, Tracy. I wonder, like, what is the role of literature in having this conversation about criminal justice or justice in general?
Well, I think that literature urges us toward those braver places, and it does so, with the conscious material, the things that are in the front of our mind that we're aware of, the actions, the characters, the perspectives, the questions. But it also acts upon us in ways that are, outside of language, and that feel visceral, that invoke memory, that invoke associations, and that change and sometimes even distort our view of where and who we are. And I feel like those things must happen before we can become, agents of change, agents of like correction. But I also want to say, like, Dwayne, you're somebody who, for me, really made me think differently about what the role of a poet in this time is. First, because, poetry, your poems seem to bear witness to an interiority that, America doesn't want to think about. Okay, somebody who has served time, but also because the work that you're doing in the law is something that I don't think I want to disconnect from the work that you're doing as an artist. And I feel like you make me understand that the distance that we go from our imaginative and creative selves to our, selves who are thinking about making a social contribution need not be large. I don't know if I said that very clearly, but I feel that, I don't know, I feel charged differently as an artist because of the way that you make this, you make these two tasks seem inextricable from one another.
No, I appreciate that. I was looking while we were talking, Sonia Sanchez. What's cool about this is like we all poets though, so we could get in like crazy and be like, yo, well, remember this time we read this Lucille Clifton poem, or I remember this. So this is Sonia Sanchez's new collected, and one of the coolest things about working with Ishmael, as I'm the poetry editor of the New York Times, is like I feel like I get to bring in things that got me through it. And it always got me through it in both a political and a personal way. Even the title of this, There's a Revolution, My Love. It's a revolution outside, like my love. Like it's somebody in this world that I'm trying to hold on to. And I'm trying to do that while I am fiercely political, while I'm fiercely thinking about how to make this place better for me and mine in the future in this country. Um, but I'm thinking about when me and Camille was kicking it about like somehow I don't know how this email thread we got into, but we was lost and thinking about poem at 30, Sonia Sanchez, which is crazy because both of us have lapped 30, which means we were having this conversation before 30. And I think about her and actually, when I imagine who I am as a poet in the world, this is, poetry is where I learned that juveniles could get tried as adults. It's Etheridge Knight that was documenting this in the 70s. Poetry is where I learned about what move was. Poetry is where I learned, like, really understood these historical figures like Crispus Attucks and the folks that Robert Hayden was writing about. And so I actually think, I think about my own legal work. And it is, when I started the Million Book Project, somebody hit me up on Twitter, was like, these books are cool and shit, but who you getting out of prison? Isn't that the thing? And I was like, look, I got 3 people out of prison this year. And then, the press was like, I just been having a bad day. I'm so glad you're doing the work you're doing. But the thing is, like, I'm only able to like operate in like some of these multiple spaces is because literature gives you the room to do so. And I think some in some ways literature gives you the obligation to do so. Like it presents the obligation that's available. And so if you can, you do. And I'm fortunate to be able to do, but I think of it more as a necessity and not even as like a plan, a roadmap or anything. It's just like more of how do you get by in the world. And I'm honored to be having this conversation with you two because it's crazy. Like, you know, I mean, I remember we used to starstruck talk about, hey, yo, that's Rita Dove right there. Oh, that's Afar. Hey, you think Afar take a picture with me? Don't go interrupting those folks, man. Don't do that, Dwayne. Just chill, right? And so it's crazy that we've gotten to the point through literature that we are having a stake in a national conversation. And people ask, does poetry matter? I think this is an example of all the ways that it does.
Mhm.
I think too, it's really important to talk about how poetry can synthesize and distill and clarify, and also, and importantly, make beautiful really complex and difficult and challenging experiences and ideas and concepts and realities, so that it becomes a thing that we can talk about, that we can work with, that we can see. That, as Wayne said, I definitely came to history. You know, the way that history was taught to me in high school was not particularly engaging. But as I got into poetry of certain periods in America, I realized I didn't understand what was going on, and I needed to read the history, and I needed to learn more. And because of poetry, I had to find out what move was. And because of poetry, I had, you know, like all these other things happen. Because of poetry, I learned more, I understood more. Same with really quality nonfiction pieces, right? The introduction, Tracy, that you have for this anthology, I got my copy too, Dwayne. It's the raccoons got yours, is what happened.
Somebody-
Yo.
The raccoons got yours. So, but the introduction where you situate 2020 summer in the context of 1964 summer and the Freedom Summer and all of what happened there and the martyrs of that time and the incredibly important work of Fannie Lou Hamer, right? Like that contextualization for some readers of this book, that will be news. And that's necessary news that comes through literature and helps understand the ways that we have moved forward and the directions that we need to continue to go. And so that to me seems one of the most crucial necessities of reading and writing. But it's also, for me as a writer, it's a pleasure to figure out how, like, that's why I'm saying the beauty, like to figure out how I can like marinate my work in this richness that is our world and figure out how to give this necessary information to my readers.
I feel like that is the task that Black poets have been committed to, you know, through the ages, you know, through the stages of Black literature in this country, because we know that history has effaced our stories, has marginalized them, but also just plain left them out, or has turned them into data. And so poems, novels, you know, vivid and insightful and intuitive nonfiction are activating the, you know, the interior spaces, the emotional stakes, the human beauty that is alive within history, but that we often sort of just brush over.
Yeah, I feel like that beauty part is so important, and that comma my love part at the end of that title, the joy, right? Like this is important. That's the other thing. Like the stories get sidelined, they get effaced, they get marginalized, or they get turned into trauma porn, right?
Yeah.
And like all we get is the trauma.
It's interesting though, because this is why you got a strawberry field in a poem. And you know, and like as a poet, I think we always struggling with what do we reveal and what do we not reveal. I was in this artist, you know, spot, this artist studio, and Alana Clark, and fabulous young Black woman. She's just dope, right? And she takes all these Black hair products and turns them into abstract pieces. And one of the things I was like meditating on is, you know, maybe for her abstraction was the only way to get at the trauma without turning the trauma into a reiteration of trauma.
Mhm.
And I walked into her studio and I saw this was like some dope writer, like artist shit, right? She had the first chapter of Scenes of Subjugation like tacked to her wall. And I looked at it and I was like, hey yo, that's a Dia Hartman shit? And she was like, yo, you know that book? And again, it was like what it means to talk to somebody on some lower frequencies, right?
Mhm.
Because one, you know what it is to like be grinding, and somebody just gave you the first chapter, the intro to read, to get hooked to it, to go get the book later. So it's just there. But then it becomes also an echo in her work, because you could tell that her work is trying to mine the trauma and the beauty, and do it in such a way that it doesn't reproduce the trauma. And I do think that's one thing that I profoundly struggle with as a writer. My mom told me what happened the day I came home, and we didn't talk about it again for another decade, literally 10 years. And when we talked about it, it was on a podcast. And I was like, we, what? And freedom is permission to speak when you want,
Mhm.
not when somebody says it's okay to speak at this moment. And it was really interesting. Like, how do I tell this story even about my mom in a way that doesn't reproduce trauma? And I think, if the essay is art, it's because it has to grapple explicitly with that question. How do you do that? How do I create a strawberry field in my piece? Um, and ultimately, I struggle. I don't know if it succeeds, but I do think that that's the challenge that we grapple with. Um, that's a badass poem too, Camille. I'm really mad that I don't have my anthology yet,
Mhm.
and I ain't gonna blame anybody because now I know why I don't have it. Somebody was given the wrong address. I'm gonna get in the right address. I want mine because it might be a raccoon that's looking for it, but I at least want the raccoon to have it if it ain't me.
Um, I want to just go back to that question, that first question, because I'm reminded in thinking, even in hearing you say that freedom is the, ability to decide when to speak. The stages that you're talking about, healing and grieving and progress, are, in some ways we turn to these texts and voices and reacting and metabolizing and then finding a way to begin to answer back. I think for many of us, those are the ways that we move through the processes that you're talking about. They're rooted in language and the ability to move forward in thought, in response to, the various forms of trauma and outrage, really, that we live with.
Yeah, Ishmael, like, yo, moderating panels with poets that know each other, they just gonna just talk. They gonna act like I ain't even here.
You make my job easy. I'm good. I do want to, Dwayne, you raised the strawberry fields and Camille's poem. I want to go back to that because, like, that poem tricked me out so much. There's that part where I don't know, the speaker or you, Camille, is recounting an encounter with the police, and you say it's like a matter of imagination that your father fit the description, but then you turn immediately to the strawberry fields, like imagining skating on the ice of the strawberry fields, even though you're from SoCal. And it's like that juxtaposition of one kind of imagination against another kind of imagination felt really important to me. And I wonder if you can just say a bit about, and I'm just kind of trying to build off of what Tracy said earlier about like literary imagination, but can you just say a bit about like, trauma porn, like we're all just discussing, and what kind of imagination can complicate our trauma or representations of our trauma?
Mm-hmm.
And duplicate and recreate. I see a couple of people in the chat asking in my poem in the anthology is called "This'll Hurt Me More," and I'm in Southern California, recalling a time in my youth when my family's driving home, and we're driving past a strawberry field that's kind of covered, tarped against the cold, and my father's pulled over in that moment, and I sort of am looking out the window, imagining separating myself from what's happening there and imagining myself ice skating on a strawberry field, which is impossible in a number of different ways. And I think that's, to me, both the positive power of our imagination and the negative power of our imagination, right? What is it that Claudia says? Black men are dying because America can't police its imagination. In Citizen, the ways in which so frequently in 2019 a young man was killed in not very far, about an hour away from where I live. And if you read or listen to the transcript, he's huge. Like, he has incredible strength. Dude was 5'6" and 140 pounds. You know, I don't think he had incredible strength. I think the imagination of the police officer had incredible strength in that story, right? And so there are these ways in which imagination is brutal and terrible and will make us monsters and will create monsters out there in the world. Also, though, our imagination creates beauty, and I imagine my loves, and I imagine my daughter as an adult, and like the possibilities of glory of that, right? Our imagination can build potential and desirable outcomes also. And I think good writing, the writing I try to do, shows both of those possibilities, the monstrous imagination at work, and then hopefully yoked in, and the kind of prosperous, fertile, beneficial imagination set free. And it's most exciting for me when both of those things can be at play at the same time.
I love the way that poem enacts something similar to what the title of the anthology does, with that sense of, urgency of revolution and the tenderness and the commitment of my love. And, this is a poem addressed ultimately to America. And it's saying, go out and get me a switch. This is going to hurt me more, but you need this, which I think is such a beautiful way of marrying those different urgencies, those different commitments.
Mm-hmm.
Wayne, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do I wonder, how do we not police the imagination, but how we empower the imagination?
Mm-hmm.
Because I also think, like, that's the flip side. I had a client once, man. This kid was like, I was reading all of his medical records and shit, and like, when you got down to it, since he was like 10 or 11, he had been considered violent and aggressive. Because one day he got upset and knocked some water off a table. And he was always a kid in all of these medical records, and I was trying to figure out why they kept describing him as aggressive. I mean, he hadn't hurt anybody. He hadn't even gotten in any fights, right? But if you read the descriptions by the psychologist, it was always that this kid was like aggressive. And I realized, because he was on these medications, and he was like 150, 60 pounds as a child. So he looked big to them. And he hadn't hit his growth spurt yet. And what was interesting to see, I was seeing him as a 16, 17-year-old when he was my client. And so he like 6'1", 5'10", 5'11", 6'1", and skinny. So it took a lot for me to imagine that something was wrong, to pull more closely over these records and realize that these adults had stigmatized him as violent consistently, because he was on medications that led him to gain weight, and he was in front of them, and he was a black boy who was at that time short and carried 120, 30, 40 pounds, right? And I think that, the thing is, that's not going to show up in the news.
Mhm.
Sometimes people say like, yo, you sweating microaggressions and you keep talking about systemic racism. And I'm like, but the thing that I think I want you to see is this kid's life was profoundly changed because people couldn't police their imagination. And I think part of the challenge for writers is how do you thoughtfully examine and make public these really private moments. And I do think you do that. And I think what's interesting though is like ultimately, this is not funny, but I'm just gonna say this. Ultimately, like your pops could have fit the description. He could have been the dude that robbed somebody. But what happens is that ain't the point of the poem. The point of the poem is that everything on the surface says this cannot possibly be him. And so it is not a stroke of imaginative policing that leads, like, it's not Sherlock Holmes that finds the person that you don't expect to do it. This is like the random police. It's like, I'm going to assert that he did it. And what was beautiful about the poem was like, nah, what matters to the reader is not my father's guilt or innocence. You'd be a goddamn fool if you think that that's why I wrote this poem. And I think that that's the struggle of writers, right? Because sometimes when we write, what we want to do is exonerate ourselves. And black folks have lived in America for too damn long trying to exonerate themselves. We trying to prove that somehow we're worthy because we're not guilty. And I found more kinship in that poem than I do in some of the narratives because the poem rejected the premise that I have to be innocent to be worthy of being loved. It like completely rejected that and pushed it to a different kind of imagination. So, I don't know. I think America needs poets. I think America needs angry poets. But I also think America needs like poets that could find ways to imagine a beauty that still confronts the horrendousness of what's going on. And we have made your poem a template for that discussion, but I do think it is like a really beautiful. I'm really glad I liked it. I just read it like twice while we were talking. So when I wasn't paying, I've been reading all kinds of poems and shit while we've been having this
Getting work
conversation,
done.
right? But like, I'm so glad that I'm like, yo, this is a badass poem, Because imagine if it wasn't good, it'd be like, oh fuck, I gotta talk about this. But no, this shit is rich and deep, and like I was like, it got strawberries in it. It's 10 o'clock on the East Coast. I don't know.
Oh, so you're losing.
It's past
I know. I
bedtime.
feel like
It's
I
not come
say
save
that
us. Come on.
All right, we got about 5 minutes before Q&A. So, audience, if you have any questions, please direct them to the Q&A. Just one more question from me. Tracy, you write in the introduction that Camille referenced. You write about the Freedom Summer of '64 and how that was a seedbed for. You might be hearing my dog whining right now, but he's okay.
Don't start talking about dogs. I'm on a tangent.
But you read about the Freedom Summer and how it's a kind of was a political seedbed for, Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Democratic Party, and for Mario Savio and free speech movement at Cal. And I'm wondering if we can think about not this anthology in particular, but anthologies in general, the kind of like long history of anthologies from like Locke's New Negro to Baraka's Black Fire to Morrison's Black Book. I wonder if they are seedbeds, and if they are seedbeds, then for what? And I ask you in particular because you and John were the editors. But I'm curious about how you're thinking about the power of anthologies right now.
Well, one thing is we get all of these different voices bearing witness to something that feels urgent to them, unsettling, and in need of exploration. And what I love in this case and in many of the anthologies that you describe is that these are reactions that are coming from one part of a large time, one of the crises or one moment within the many different crises and uprisings that characterize a 12 or 15 month period. And so for me, what it does is it maps a kind of psychic map, like these are the forms of grief. These are the forms of consciousness that need to be brought into language by all of the different people. It reminds me that history is something that is full of contradictions. We're not all moved by the same things. We're not all moved to the same forms of reflection or even intervention. And to me, these voices feel like they're on the ground. They are processing and synthesizing, but they're also still in the thick of it. And I feel like so much of the history that I received when I was younger had the illusion of something that had been settled and something that had been kind of like parsed by a discrete, remote, and logical intellect. And what we have here is many different voices doing that work in different moments and for different ends. Some people are thinking about family. Some people are thinking about the environment. Some people are thinking about police reform or prison reform. And others of us are, moved to think about historical voices. And all of those things are necessary if we want to make the fullest kind of sense out of where we have just been.
Thank you. It's a beautiful, thoughtful answer. I think with that, I want to turn to audience questions. So I believe we'll be having them read to us.
Yes. Hi. What a conversation. In fact, the co-editor of this book, John Freeman, is watching, and he
Hi, John.
Hello, John. He put in a chat, and he just called out a phrase that one of you spoke, which is, quote, "Imagine a beauty that also confronts the horrendousness of what's going on."
I think Camille said that.
Camille said that. Yeah, it's so beautiful, and of course, that's what literature can do. Is really go there and go into that. Sometimes I feel like the harsher the thing being discussed, the language is what allows us to go there. The beauty sort of gives us, sustains us, holds us as we're able to go into the experience of this, which leads to a question, which came from Susie. And it's, you spoke about writing not only about trauma and outrage, but writing in the midst of ongoing trauma and outrage. Often we hear that writers need distance in order to tackle difficult subjects in their work, but it sounds like that kind of distance wasn't necessarily possible with this project. How did you navigate that as authors? This is to everyone.
I mean, I'm willing to take that because as a Black woman in America, I've had plenty of time to think about these questions. Yeah. It's like, these aren't new. It didn't just show up in 2020 and I had to quickly figure out how to think about this. I've been thinking about it my whole life, and my parents' whole life, and my grandparents' whole life, and on and on and on. So I think it wasn't hard. It wasn't hard to come at some of these conversations through poetry, through nonfiction, and write with clarity about it, because it's not all of a sudden popping up on me. Sometimes the rage would come on me, and that rage would charge me to sit down. And that's as happened with this particular poem. I just woke up mad that morning. I woke up mad and I wrote. And then out came that poem. But it's a poem that talks about something that happened to me when I was 7 years old. That's plenty of time for recollection, on top of what was happening in the summer of 2020, right? So I think that that's an important thing to realize for so many of us in this book. That Craig Santos Perez piece in this book, he's not talking about all of a sudden things are different because I'm in the pandemic in Micronesia. He's been talking about climate change and unequal healthcare distribution and food access and all the things he talks about. He's been talking about in his whole career. And I feel like that then gives us the ability to not be writing in a way that feels topical and it's going to pass, and the kind of fad of what we're writing will be done because you're no longer 2020 is over, because the seam that we're tapping into goes way deep into the mountain. And we could be talking, we're going to be talking about it for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
I want to say one thing about the beauty comment. I feel, Camille, you answered that question so powerfully and so perfectly. But I also want to say that, it's not just that beauty is a balm that allows us to look at the difficult and deal with the difficult. It might also get in us in such a way that we can use that which is beautiful within us and creative rather than destructive within us to respond to the difficult and the impossible in the world. And in some ways, we're talking about policing the imagination. We're also talking about allowing beauty to guide us into conflict, or as we find ourselves in conflict or uncertainty or apprehension. And so that feels important in a way. It's not just to help us, respond to what we witness, but to help us kind of do the work in a way.
Dwayne, any thoughts you want to add on that, or we can move to the next one?
We can move to the next one. I think they both captured everything. And honestly, I think like Camille captured it perfectly. It's not like, she's been thinking about this for a while, we all think about a dozen things or 1,000 things for a long time, whether we're writers or not. I think it captures it perfectly.
Great. Okay, so question from Carol. This anthology focused on the monumental events of 2020. What do you think about 2021 so far? And what is your biggest hope going forward? Maybe just one primary hope among all those many that are possible. And this is for each of you also.
I would just say one thing is we live in the United States and a lot of people are being vaccinated. A lot of people are choosing not to be vaccinated. But there are whole countries who just don't have access to the vaccine. And so I guess maybe my biggest hope is to think about what it means to, for us to continue to think about this as a global problem. Sometimes when we have local solutions, we stop thinking about things as global problems. And I've just been thinking lately about the fact that, you got whole countries that just don't have access in the way that we do. And so I think that's one issue that's just paramount.
I love that.
Anyone else? What is your assessment of 2021 so far, and biggest hope for 2021 and onwards, given what's happened last year?
If I'm just gonna stay on this one that Dwayne's brought up about access to the vaccine, I also feel like we're gonna have we have to have a reckoning in this country. Where are we in this country? 560,000 or something dead. It's a number so big I've lost track. I used to, like, when we were at the 100,000 mark or even up to 275, I was like, I knew what the number was by the week, and I've just lost that now. But those people belonged to people. They were people's mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and children and coworkers and teachers. 500,000 people gone, like some sort of sci-fi movie where you just wake up and like people are gone, but really disproportionately, hugely disproportionately. Navajo Nation, just huge losses in Navajo Nation, right? And then just next door, the white folks in Tucson are fine. They're okay. They can be like, we don't want the vaccine, right? Like, how can we, within 100 miles of each other, have such a radically different experience of devastation? And so what I'm finding, we lost people in our family, was Black people in New York, in my husband's family, like a lot of people we lost. And then I live in this very white community, and people are like, well, I don't know if we're going to need the vaccine. I was like, I don't know about you, but like, my people die from this. And so I feel like I have a very different reaction until everybody in my family can get vaccinated. I'm going to like stay in my little tunnel, right? My hope is that we can have a real conversation, a true reckoning about what these losses mean and what the disparity between which communities were so dramatically affected and which communities they weren't, what that represents about healthcare and access and supports that we have in this country. That's my hope. My concern is that will not come to fruition.
Yeah, I resist even the idea that we're now in 2021 and 2020 was a different year, because it feels like we're still gripped by the same questions. I love a moment in an essay in the anthology by Michael Claber Diggs, where white people are saying, "I'm sorry, how can I help? What was happening in June when everybody was getting all those text messages?" And he said, things are going to get hard for me when things start to feel like they're going back to normal for you. And we are at a moment where many people, like you said, Camille, feel like, okay, here we go. We're back. We're back to where we were. We're back to where we should be. And I hope that there is a way that, we can pull back on that and imagine or insist that there is a shared sense of reflection and grief and maybe even ritual, if that's possible, that we can participate in together to kind of feel, name, acknowledge this loss, because it's not contained by a year. It's not even contained by a pandemic.
That's great. Thank you. Maybe one last question, Smale, then you can close with one of yours. Sound okay? Yeah? Okay. He's muted. All right. So Anonymous asks, who are some poets you're reading currently, and who are poets you would recommend aspiring new poets need to read? And I would sort of consolidate some other things and add to that. Today, in particular, given the nature of this conversation, what poets are really getting into the heart of what's going on, besides those of us on the panel?
Yeah, you should read Auden. Read Ed Roberson.
Ed Roberson has a new book that is so gorgeous right now. Ask What Has Changed is the title of the book.
Yeah.
I've been really moved by John Murillo's book, Contemporary American Poetry.
Yeah, that's really fire.
Yeah. I have Jericho's Tradition on my desk, which I feel.
Natalie Diaz is joined as Funky. And it's interesting because you talk about like the idea of like there's a revolution outside my love, and I think her book is one of those books that is fiercely intimate and also political. I think it's something that's powerful about thinking about how to thread that needle and how to do it in a language that has seemed built on oppressing you. And I think
even that title, Post-Colonial Love Poem.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some good
other
stuff
great
out there.
poets in the anthology too: Joshua Bennett, Patricia Smith,
Patricia,
Don Lundy Martin, and others.
And I think also all of us on this panel have written memoirs and nonfiction as well. And there's beautiful nonfiction work in this anthology too. And I think that that movement between those two modalities for some of us is really important to allow the kind of expansiveness that nonfiction can allow you to enter. So, and then the condensation that poetry demands. So you could look, for instance, at Natasha Trethewey's two most recent collections, one of poetry and one of nonfiction, which often deal with similar topics, but differently, right? And so to move back and forth between creative nonfiction and memoirs and essay collections and poetry, I think is at this moment in particular a really useful thing for me as a reader and also as a writer, because it gives me access to different ways of saying what needs to be said.
It's funny, I got a stack of books like right beside me, and it's true. Some of it is prose, Caitlin Greenidge's book, Liberty, and some of it is poetry, you know, like Sonia Sanchez's new joint. But I also got Black Boy, and I got Honore's new new novel,
that
which is
book, Honore's new.
800 pages.
Oh,
you know.
I was talking about her new poetry collection, which
Oh, the
is
Phyllis
also
Wheatley joint,
amazing.
yeah. So it says, I
Oh,
mean, I
we
think
could.
there's some
Who
hundreds
asked
of
this
books.
question? We could just talk forever. I mean,
I know.
Tracy
Yeah.
has like a whole pocket. How many years did you do it? You picked a poem a day. She talked
Yeah.
about a poem a day for like at length for 5 minutes. You were able to do that. So you could have us here for till midnight Eastern time. I think midnight California time, right? Well, we could do this if we wanted
I
to.
can do Midnight California
Yeah,
time.
I think
I got good hair.
Gwen's gonna peace out soon. One more question before that, before we break. I was really struck by a line in Dwayne's essay about feeling inconsistent about thought around the incarcerated and violence. And I think one of that essay's many virtues is just the fact that it's very bald about being ambivalent and inconsistent and confused when it comes to violence of all kinds in our nation. And I wonder if, by way of closing, we can just speak a bit about, I guess, the virtues of inconsistency and ambiguity. I'll go with you, Dwayne, first.
Yeah, honestly, I you know, haven't been given the opportunity a lot over the past few years, maybe to be on panels. I realized that one of the things that these occasions demand of you is to be some kind of oracle. You know, you're supposed to know what's happening. And I think it's all a lie and it's all a pose. And as what makes me a good writer, if I am a good writer, is my willingness to grapple with what I don't know. And I do that before you see what's on the page. Like I do that through these revisions, you know. I do that through the conversations with my people that I have as I'm trying to write something. And I think in a piece I was trying to actually publicly do that in a way that I thought was demanded based on the subject. Cause, you know, I felt like I would just be in spaces and people would be like, yo, explain to me why you're an abolitionist. You know, who the fuck told you I was an abolitionist? And be like, explain to me why you think everybody should be out of prison. Who said I mean that? Explain to me why you think people should die in prison. Who said that's how I feel? And you walk into all of these spaces and people are trying to assert what it is that you believe because, you know, we all become ideologues and nobody wants to admit it. They like the right is an ideologue, but I'm not. I'm just actually speaking the truth. Motherfucker, you on the corner too, you know, with a soapbox, right? And so my piece was trying to say, admit that, you know, admit that I am actually conflicted and that justice is not actually being right. I think justice is taking action despite being uncertain and finding action that is justified in the face of that uncertainty. And we live in a country, particularly, you know, around criminal justice, where we take action and fail to acknowledge uncertainty and assert this belief that we're right. And that is why it's unjust. You know, it's not unjust because we get it wrong. It's unjust because we pretend that we are certain even when we know we're not. And the defense attorneys do it, the prosecutors do it, the judges do it, the families do it. I mean, you listen to families, it's like, this is a horrible person, he's gonna kill again. He killed somebody 20 years ago. You don't even fucking believe that. You know what I mean? Like, why'd you even say that, right? But we live in a country that like believes that you have voice because of your certainty. And I wanted to write a piece, one that was like, my mom is just as important as the vice presidential candidate. And two, that says like, my uncertainty with this situation matters, even as I advocate for the freedom and the change of policies that will lead to freedom for more folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's powerfully put.
And with that, our conversation comes to a close. Thank you, Camille, Tracy, Dwayne, for this excellent conversation. I'm Ishmael Muhammad for the Bay Area Book Festival